Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Today, I'm going to be answering some of your questions that people have sent in either via email or through DMs on social media. I did a few of these episodes last year at some point, sort of Q&A style episodes, and they were super popular and went down really well. And I had kind of planned to do maybe one per quarter going forwards of just kind of a roundup of Q&A, but somehow it fell off my radar and I had completely forgotten about it. And so we're getting back to it now. It's definitely not been once a quarter, but I will do my best going forwards to actually try and remember to do these a little bit more frequently because they always are very popular episodes. And if you did not get a chance to send in a question, then send it in now, and I do keep a running list of them. So today I'm going to be answering some questions that were sent in recently, but also a couple of questions that were sent in previously that were just kind of on my list and I had not gotten around to. I will not get to every single question that I was sent on today's episode. So if you sent me a question and I do not answer it today, it is on my list. I will include it in a future episode. So like I said, I just can't get to all of them today. And there's also some questions that I will likely sort of do longer, maybe full episodes on, just because the questions are a bit more like the topic lends itself to an entire podcast episode. So all that to say, if you don't hear your question, do not worry. I do have a record of it. I will eventually get to that question, but I'm going to do my best to get through as many of them as I can today on today's episode. So let's dive right in. First question right off the bat, and this is one of those ones I am going to answer it a little bit today, but it's really actually going to be a longer form podcast in the future. But the question reads, generally, what does hypermobility look like in dance? And what do we need to be aware of with praise versus caution in terms of some more specific flexibility enhanced movements? Love this question. And like I said, it is a very, very, very in-depth topic that I could get into with some pretty nuanced answers, especially when we look at that sort of sub-question or the second part about what praise versus caution looks like. So I'm going to very generally answer just a little bit of that sort of what does hypermobility look like in dance today, but I do have plans in the future to do sort of a whole series of podcast episodes about hypermobility because, like I said, it's a very complex and sort of in-depth topic that I want to make sure I cover well and also bring on some other experts in that field to hear from them as well. But I do want to address this just a little bit. So in terms of what does hypermobility look like, I think there is a misconception that hypermobility is always going to look like extreme amounts of flexibility. And so in our head, we maybe picture some of the people that are into doing a lot of like contortion or almost, Cirque du Soleil style contortion or things like that. Or you're going to have a dancer who's super bendy and kind of Gumby-like or things like that. But that is not always the case. That can be the case, but we can also just have a dancer who is flexible but not hypermobile. So they're not the exact same thing. When we're talking about hypermobility, we are talking about our joint's ability to move through space, and then a joint that is hypermobile is generally moving through a larger than average physiological range at that joint. This can look like a lot of flexibility, but it can actually also look like people who are maybe seemingly limited in mobility. And that is because the nervous system, if there's a lot of hypermobility in someone's system and it's maybe not well controlled, the nervous system might actually try and protect that amount of mobility that they have. And it often will do that by limiting mobility that is available. So sometimes we have dancers who really struggle with their flexibility, and teachers are a bit stumped and thinking, oh, they're always doing, the same stretches as their other classmates, and the other dancers are improving in their flexibility. And this dancer is getting really, really stuck in progressing in flexibility. And when we actually look at them and assess them, they may actually have underlying hypermobility that their body is protecting against, which is why if they are continuing to stretch, they may not gain flexibility. And in a lot of cases, they may actually almost lose flexibility because the body sort of tightens up to protect that even further. So we cannot sort of think about hypermobility presentation in terms of how flexible somebody is. It is not always directly correlated, and sometimes they can be related, but it is not always going to be the case. The other things in terms of, what does hypermobility look like in dancers? Things that maybe, especially teachers, may not be as aware of, or even dancers themselves, but hypermobility can present like chronic fatigue or just really high levels of fatigue for the amount of exertion somebody is putting out. It's a lot harder to just hold your body upright against gravity if you're hypermobile than if you're not. And so they're expending much more energy for the same types of tasks. So oftentimes there can be a lot of fatigue. It can be frequent or repetitive or seemingly almost like quote unquote constant injuries in dancers. Sometimes we get dancers coming in and saying, it's just one injury after another, after another, after another. And when we actually look at them, there could be some underlying hypermobility going on. So if you have a dancer who is sort of constantly being injured, that might be something that we want to have on our radar is this dancer hypermobile? Chronic pain can be associated with hypermobility, and especially if we start to get into some of the hypermobility spectrum disorders or even people with underlying connective tissue disorders like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome that can be related to hypermobility, we might see sort of pain presentations. Dancers who are more hypermobile may be slower to build strength. So again, they could be doing the exact same exercises as some of their other counterparts, but they might actually not be seeing the same strength results as quickly as other dancers. Another thing we might see in terms of presentation is dancers who have decreased proprioception. So that's sort of our ability to know where our body is in space or sort of control our movements. And so these might be dancers who present as sometimes looking just like maybe a little bit uncoordinated or having trouble internalizing corrections. Like they, you say, straighten your knee, for instance, and they say, well, my knee is straight, or it feels to them like their knee is straight. Maybe if they look at it in the mirror, they can see that it's not, but in their body, it may feel that it's straight, even if it's not. It can be dancers who present as maybe being a little bit more clumsy than others, things like that. So that altered proprioception is quite common in a hypermobile population. So those are just a few of the things that we may see show up in hypermobile dancers that don't have anything to do with flexibility, but are common presentations of these dancers who maybe have seemingly quote unquote average flexibility, but actually have underlying joint hypermobility. Those might be the types of things that you could be noticing, especially as a teacher, that again are not directly related to flexibility. So, like I said, I plan on really doing a deep dive into hypermobility in the upcoming months. So I'm not going to get too much more into this question today, but I did just want to answer part of it because I do think it's helpful for people to be aware of some of those other presentations that aren't directly related to flexibility. All right, on to question 2. This question says, any advice for someone who wants to work with performance-based athletes? I love this question. I'm going to say, first and foremost, because I get this question a lot, people are sometimes interested in like how I ended up specializing in dancers or what my journey looked like. And so if you have not listened to way back, episode number 1 of the podcast, that is all about my journey as a dance physical therapist and how I sort of got to where I am today. So I would encourage you to go back and listen to that because I think it has great information and is a good summary of what my journey looks like. Of course, this is not like the only way you can get into this type of field, but I'm just going to plug that episode because I do think that it is a nice example of one way that somebody can get into the field of working with performance-based athletes, and in my case, mostly dancers. But in terms of other advice, I would say first and foremost, having a willingness to learn and a willingness to continue to take advantage of learning opportunities and continuing education and just always being hungry for more knowledge. I think a lot of people who go into helping professions inherently have that quality about them anyway. But sometimes we see people who graduate and get their designation, licensure, whatever it is, and then sort of almost stop learning. They stop being curious. They stop sort of having that hunger or thirst for more knowledge. And I would say, especially working with performance-based athletes, I probably spend more of my day asking questions than I do giving answers. And so I know a lot about dance and especially working with specific dance populations, but I certainly don't know everything about every genre, every style of dance, especially if it's styles that I've not trained in myself. I also work with a lot of other performance-based athletes like circus artists or other artistic athletes, and I don't know as much about their sports or their activities. And so again, I'm often asking questions and really searching out knowledge and trying to always sort of stay fresh and learn more information. So I think having that open mind and like a real willingness to learn is honestly probably the first step, especially if you're somebody who's coming from a non-dance background or a non-performance-based or artistic athlete background. Some of the best dance physios, but they're not all physios, dance professionals, we'll call them, people who work with dancers in a professional capacity. Some of the best people I know are not people who have any personal experience in dance, but just have this like really, really, really open mind and willingness to learn and a curiosity around learning everything they can about the industry and about how dancers work and what makes dance unique. So I really think that that's like a huge part of being successful in working with this population. Number two, I would say join as many networks or groups or communities as you can. I've talked a lot on the podcast in previous episode about organizations like IADMS or Healthy Dancer Canada, and there's tons of these organizations out there at different national levels, international levels, even community levels. I know in certain cities they have groups of providers who all network together, and so I would say seek out that information as much as you can, join those networks, and then get involved with them. I see a lot of people who join things like that, but don't actually really participate. And so maybe they're, just sitting back and taking in the information, and that is fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But I'm a really big believer in you get as much out as you put in. And so if you really want to learn from and benefit from these organizations, really being involved and participating in opportunities. So whether that's conferences or, networking events online or mentorship programs and things like that, take advantage of all of those things that are available to you. I would say that's been one of the best things that I've done in my career in terms of creating networks and meeting lots of different people. And then I would say really continue, I suppose, if that is what your background is in, but staying involved in the industry. And I think this can look different for different people, but taking class for yourself or attending performances or going to rehearsals or watching company class and all of those types of things, those are so important for me to stay fresh in my information and know what's going on. Even like the local competition circuit, I will watch some of the live streams. I'll go to them sometimes. I set up, information booths for teachers, whatever it is, staying connected to. And so like sort of having a finger on the pulse of what is happening in the industry, I think is really, really helpful just to know how things are evolving or what trends are right now. And really, having sort of some inside information. But for me also personally taking class for myself always gives me insight into things that dancers I'm working with are dealing with as well. And then finally, and this is not an exhaustive list of things, but the things that sort of pop into my head immediately, I would say finally, be prepared to volunteer, especially at the beginning of your career. But even now, I volunteer quite a lot still in terms of providing backstage coverage for companies traveling through town or, just different opportunities. So I think as much as I really truly believe that people within the dance industry and art in general need to be compensated appropriately for their skill and expertise, I also think there's a time and a place to volunteer and be giving back. And so finding that balance and what works for you. But I have seen a trend, and so this is certainly not across the board, but I've seen a bit of a trend of early career people wanting to always be paid appropriately for every opportunity. And again, like absolutely your education and knowledge and skills are worth something. And in an ideal world, we would be compensated for all of that. But if you are trying to, build a network and build a name for yourself and make connections, I do think there is a time and a place to be giving back in some capacity. And so, everybody needs to evaluate what that looks like for themselves. And obviously you don't want to burn yourself off or burn yourself out giving, things away for free. But I think there is a balance between giving back to the industry and, being able to volunteer in some capacity and then also be paid for your services in other capacities. So that is one thing I would also say as well is really, kind of be prepared or take advantage, maybe is even a better way of saying that, of some volunteer opportunities that are available, because I do think we can gain a lot from those. All right, that was question number 2. We are going to move on to question number 3. And this was somebody who submitted a couple of questions, kind of a little bit diving into sort of they termed it like the dark side of dance. And I'm going to answer one of the questions today. I'm going to save one for a future sort of podcast episode. But this question pertained specifically to how to deal with dancers who are faking injuries to get out of shows. And I found this to be a really interesting question because it is not something that I commonly see with dancers that I work with. So my immediate first thought is that this is quite a big red flag because dancers generally want to perform. I have yet to meet very many dancers, if any, who are not excited about performance opportunities. So whether that is a show or a competition, like recital, whatever it is, more often than not, I have dancers who are sort of, I don't want to say faking it, but they're almost overstating like how capable they are, especially if they're dealing with like pain or an injury, in order to be able to perform. They're almost rushing rehab timelines or things like that. What I see more commonly is maybe dancers really wanting to perform, but not always wanting to put in the hours and the amount of work required in classes and rehearsals. And again, this is maybe something we see slightly more in younger populations of dancers, but I'm sure if you teach younger dancers, you've probably dealt with dancers who maybe have preferred styles or genres of dance and then maybe some less preferred ones. And so they will seemingly be conveniently, quote unquote, injured during their less preferred style of dance. But then the next day or even later that same evening, they're totally fine for their more preferred style of dance. So we certainly do see situations like that. Where dancers might be, faking an injury, milking an injury, whatever you want to call it. But for me, I rarely see it in the context of dancers wanting to get out of a show or a performance. And so for me, if that is happening, that is an immediate red flag as to what else might be going on, what other underlying things could be at play here. Even dancers who are maybe, elaborating or exaggerating an injury to get out of class and rehearsal. Again, that is going to be a little bit of a red flag, but maybe more of a yellow flag because oftentimes what I see is it comes down to sort of preferred genres of dance and maybe not preferred. But if we see them trying to get out of shows, I would really be questioning sort of what is going on. And things that immediately pop to my mind would be, are they burned out or sort of overtraining and they've just kind of hit a wall and they're not able to just continue to sort of push through at a level that they were before? Could it have something to do with maybe like bullying or some sort of power dynamic that's going on, maybe between dancers within the group or between, artistic staff and dancers, teachers and dancers, something like that? I would definitely be questioning if there's maybe something behind the scenes going on that you're maybe not aware of, or dancers who are potentially struggling with mental health issues. So is there anxiety, depression, any other mood disorders or things like that at play? Because again, in my experience and with the thousands of dancers that I work with, they almost always are so desperate to be able to perform, even if it means that they can't fully participate in classes and rehearsals and things like that. They want to go out and perform to the best of their ability. I would say, so that's what I want to say about kind of like what my initial thoughts were to this question. In terms of dealing with this, if you have dancers and who you're in this situation, I would say one of the ways to address this, or one of the most effective ways to address it, is to have a really concrete injury reporting procedure. So whether you're a studio or you're a company or you're a school or whatever setting that you're in, there should be some sort of injury reporting procedure that is happening where we are tracking all of the injuries that are being reported in a consistent way. And every studio does this differently. Some it's electronically, some it might be written, some are the teacher's recording it, some, the student might be going to some sort of an administrative staff and they're the ones who are recording it. It doesn't really matter, but there needs to be a consistent way of doing this that everybody on board is aware of and everyone's following the same procedure. And then we need to have some sort of consistent way of dealing with the dancers who are injured. And so again, we sometimes have situations where people are still required to attend, but maybe they're sitting on the side watching. We have other situations where maybe dancers sit at the back of the studio and they take notes on what's happening. They do their arms and their heads if it's like a lower body injury and they can't participate. Again, every studio or every setting is going to have their own way of dealing with what injury protocols look like, but it needs to be consistent for every student that you're dealing with. Because if dancers know that anytime they tell a teacher that XYZ is going on, that it's going to be dealt with appropriately and follow like a structured procedure, then hopefully they're going to report injuries when they happen because they know that they're not going to get penalized or somehow like have any negative consequences for reporting legitimate injuries. But it's also going to disincentivize kids, or I say kids, it could be any dancer. It's going to disincentivize dancers from quote unquote faking an injury if they know that they have to go through this whole sort of reporting process. It's not just, I'm going to tell this teacher at the beginning of class that I've hurt whatever it is, or I have this injury and I'm going to sit out of this class, but then I'm going to pop right to my next class after this and I'm going to participate at 100%. Like they're going to know that that's not really an option when it's a consistent reporting across all teachers in a studio or across all artistic staff. I've not done a super great job of explaining this right now, but if you're interested more in actually diving into like what that looks like in terms of how we should be managing dance injuries and trying to cut down on some of this, knowing like when is it a serious injury, when is it not a serious injury, how do we manage participation in class, I do have a webinar recording sort of training on this on my website. I will link it in the show notes. It's free if you're interested in downloading it. It goes much more in depth about kind of like the things you want to consider and how to put together like a proper injury tracking procedure for a studio or a company or those types of settings. But in terms of the original question of how do we deal with dancers sort of faking injuries to get out of shows, like I said, immediate red flag to me. I would really be digging into what else is going on, but then also making sure that we have appropriate reporting and tracking procedures in place so that we know how dancers are progressing through injuries. The other part of that I will just quickly add on to that is making sure that you have consistent communication with like healthcare teams as well. So again, this is going to look different depending on what setting you're in. If you have healthcare, embedded in your company or in your school, and so they're part of your staff, your communication procedures are going to look different versus a dancer who's maybe seeking out healthcare support at like a private clinic or something outside. But there should be some sort of communication that can be used between all parties involved so that we're not getting any misinformation or sort of, maybe half information that is being transmitted between different parties. So that's the other thing I would add to that, is just making sure we have good communication. All right, next question. And actually, I'm just going to read you this question because I'm not even going to answer it, which is a bit of a tease perhaps. But I had somebody, it was actually a parent, a dance parent, who wrote in and asked, what things should we consider or be looking out for when switching to a new dance studio? I loved this question, and I am actually going to do a whole future episode. In fact, it's going to be next week's episode on this question in particular, and things from like a physiotherapist perspective. So I guess this is more of a plug for next week's episode because I'm not actually going to answer it today, but I thought it was a great question that this dance parent was even considering, like, what types of things should a dancer or a family be looking for if they're looking for a new studio home? So stay tuned for next week. I'm going to answer that question, but in much more depth. And then finally, for today's episode, someone wrote in and asked, have you ever answered the rapid fire questions yourself? So if you've listened to any of the guest episodes where I have a guest on for any of those podcast episodes, at the very end, I always finish with asking people these like 5 rapid fire, or they're meant to be rapid fire, but like they don't have to be that rapid fire, but 5 closing questions. And I have not ever answered them myself, I don't think. 1 or 2 of them, I think I have been asked when I've been a guest on someone else's podcast. But in terms of actually going through and answering them myself, I don't think I've ever done that. And so I thought it'd be a fun way to finish today's episode is just quickly go through those 5 rapid fire questions and you can hear my own answers. Some of them you might already know because I think I have had discussions with other guests about, what my answer would be based on what their answers were. But we're going to go through them anyway. So question number 1, what's your favorite style or genre of dance? And my answer to that is probably contemporary ballet or contemporary. I say contemporary ballet because I think I can't choose between ballet or contemporary. So something, a muddle of ballet, contemporary, or some form of contemporary ballet would be my favorite. Question number 2, would you rather be on the stage or in the studio? If you have listened to this podcast for any length of time, I think that you probably know that my answer to that is in the studio, like 1,000%. I was never, even when I was younger, a dancer who loved the stage. Although, so this kind of like ties back a bit to that previous question, I still got excited about performing. So it wasn't that I ever had like aspirations of being on stage professionally, but I still loved show days, competition days, being on stage, the excitement. Like I loved that, even though the studio was 1,000% my happy place. Like I would pick the studio over the stage every day of the week, but I would still have, jumped at every opportunity to be on stage, if that makes sense. So again, that's why to me, that previous question is a red flag if we specifically have dancers who are trying to get out of shows and performances, because I think if a dancer is in that situation, we have to be starting to ask questions about, maybe what else is going on, or are they having issues with other aspects of dance that maybe are not directly related to that performing piece. Anyway, I digress. Back to these questions. Studio, 1,000% has always been the studio. I absolutely love the studio and would pick it every time. All right, number 3. if you could dance with or share the stage with any dancer, past or present, who would it be and why? The first person that popped into my head, and this maybe relates back to my answer to the previous question, first person that popped into my head was Crystal Pite. So she's a local Vancouver choreographer. I'm sure most of you are aware of her. She is incredibly well known, like around the world. And when I was sitting down to plan this episode out and sort of think about these questions, Ballet BC had just announced their season for next year, like their 26-27 season, and they're going to be doing an entire performance, like I think it's 3 pieces of hers, an entire show of Crystal Pite pieces. And like I said, she's from Vancouver. She's like a bit of an icon. But my reason for picking her for this answer is not that I necessarily want to dance with her or even share the stage with her, but I would be so fascinated to be a part of her choreographic process. If you've ever seen any of her work, you'll know that a lot of the way that she choreographs or a lot of her pieces almost have like this feeling of like all of the dancers becoming one organism. Like they're almost moving about the stage and sort of it's oftentimes these very cool like movement patterns that make it feel like it's like this entire organism all to itself. And I would just be so fascinated to learn more about or be a part of that choreographic process. So this question, she was the first person that popped into my head, but I think part of that was because of that announcement of the pieces that she is doing next year. But yeah, I just think it would be so cool to be in the studio and be even just a fly on the wall to see her entire choreographic process, because I'm a big fan of her work, but have no idea how she gets those results on stage. All right, number 4. What's one thing that you would go back and tell your younger self as a dancer? This one was probably the question I had the most difficulty with in terms of like coming up with an answer. And I think that I would just say to continue to trust your gut instinct and just follow that sort of path, like follow that instinct. I was a dancer, or a kid in general, who kind of always just knew what I wanted, maybe without putting a lot of thought into it. I can be really indecisive when it comes to probably like kind of meaningless type things, like what's for dinner tonight or things like that. I can be incredibly indecisive. But when it comes to bigger decisions or, sort of bigger things like the trajectory of my life or what career path or what school I wanted to go to or what training I was going to do, those things just always, like, I just knew. I don't ever remember really, humming and hawing over those types of decisions. And so I would just say continue to trust that kind of like, whether it was like a gut instinct or whatever that feeling was. I think when I was a kid and a teenager or like a younger dancer, I didn't know what that was necessarily. But now that I look back on that, I think that is what it was. And I would just say continue to follow that and continue to trust that, because it has served me well in life up to this point. All right, final question, number 5. If there was one thing that you could change about the dance world, what would it be? I think this question's most saying why as well. But anyway, what would it be? I think that I have talked about this on previous podcast episodes before, and certainly as a guest on other podcast episodes, but I always come back to regulation. I think so much of what is problematic within the dance world could be addressed, or at least start to be addressed, if we had some sort of formal regulation or governance within the dance industry. Don't get me wrong, I don't think we're going to solve every single problem, and I do think there could be challenges that arise with that, but so much of what we're limited in, and whether that is changing practices of how dance teachers are trained, whether that is, even like industry standards in terms of how people get paid and compensated, like the number of dance businesses that don't even follow the law when it comes to paying people like minimum wage or labor standards and things like that is mind-boggling. And I realize that they should be following those. So we don't even need specific dance industry governance for that sort of thing. Like they should just be following, whether it's like provincial or state or federal regulations. But whole nother discussion. I won't get into that right now. But I do think regulation and having some sort of governance within the industry would be a good start to addressing a lot of the challenges that we see. So I had other things in my head when I was thinking about answers to this question, and I kind of went back and forth, but I actually think that some of those other issues or other things that I would change about the dance world would actually be improved if we just had regulation within the industry. So I'm going to stick with that answer. I've given that answer before, but I do think regulation within the dance industry would make meaningful change to especially the types of dancers and the types of settings and situations that I am in. So those are my answers to the 5 rapid fire questions that you will often hear me asking other guests on the podcast episode. That is where I'm going to wrap it up today. Like I said, I did not get to every single question, and I know I didn't, but I do have the rest of them written down, and I will do another Q&A episode in the near future. If you have not had a chance to send in a question, or you just all of a sudden thought of a question that you want answered on the podcast, please send it in to me. You can send it via email, or you can send me a DM over social media at dancephysioerica with a K, and I will add it to my list of questions that I will answer in the next Q&A episode. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.